My work primarily focuses on thinking about what the objects that are not used anymore, ruins, decaying buildings, empty buildings, what's their role within contemporary architecture, and what does fascination with ruination and decay means for architecture proper. So I'm not so much interested in the notion of romantic ruin and architecture use of this romantic ruin, but how does the ruin connect to the problems of contemporary architecture, and what does this fascination with decay that we can observe in internet galleries, in contemporary art, and as we will see further on, in some architectural practices, what does this mean for the situation of architecture today? And whenever I think about architecture today, I think that the good old way of establishing a critique is the only way to go forward still, even though some claim that we are living in a post-critical society. And I would like to start this talk with something that seems a little bit outdated quote. I'm sure that using a quote from the 18th century is the best way to to kill off any excitement in the audience, but I will still make it because I think it's an extremely important quote. Also, the 18th century is a time when our way of life, when our economy, our society has been built up, or has been started to be defined as in the way that we know it today. And I'm talking about a specific occurrence in Frankfurt in 1796, which was a very tumultuous period. In one way, you had lots of changes in economy. You had industrial revolution spreading from England to the continent. But more importantly, you also had a political revolution, the French Revolution. And the French revolutionary troops were besieging Frankfurt, the German city. And they destroyed a certain part of Frankfurt in that year. And a year later, Goethe came to the city, his native city, and observed the ruins of what has been his grandfather's house. And he wrote a letter to his friend Schiller, and it goes like this. My grandfather's house, its courtyard and its gardens, has been transformed from the parochial patrician home of an old Frankfurt elder into the most useful trading and marketplace by wisely enterprising people. Curious coincidence, during the bombardment, conspired to see the structure perish, but even today, reduced for the most part to a pile of rubble, it is still worth twice as much as the current owners paid my family for it 11 years ago. Conceivably, the whole thing may, in the future, be bought and restored by yet another entrepreneur, and you can easily see that it would, in more than one sense, stand as a symbol of thousands of other instances in this industrious city, and in particular, in my own eyes. So the fact that I find this rather lengthy quote extremely interesting is that I think it marks a change in perception. It talks about a building that has been destroyed, and yet its present worth, only 1 year after the bombardment, is twice as much as it used to be when it was whole. And of course, the most important thing here is that the gaze of the entrepreneur is what it gives it additional worth. It's when an entrepreneur looks at a ruined building, he doesn't perceive just what's there. He perceives what it could become in the future, and this is what makes it potentially extremely more valuable than its present worth. And that's the word, potentially, or potential, that I would like to focus at the start of this talk. Because it's a very tricky word. It's, first of all, it's one of the most used, misused, and problematically used words, in particular with relation to architects. Because architects are so often self-proclaimed or thought of as people who try to find potential in the buildings and develop it. And I think that this can be problematic as well as great, because the potential is necessary, something that doesn't exist. And the ruin, comparatively, is an object that has a lot of past. So it used to be a building with specific role, with specific agenda, with specific goals. And it has this supposed potential somewhere in the future. There's a point in the future which gives it worth, but it doesn't have any present. In a way, the ruin is a building without a present, and that makes it extremely interesting. You can project any sort of future in it, but in a point of history right now, it's basically worthless. And that's one of the reasons why commercials and ruins go so well together. This is an example from Kiev, Ukraine. The commercial for redeveloping old buildings go very well with decay, with ruination. Decay sells well in a way. It's the ultimate entrepreneurial object, perhaps. And I think that if we pursue this kind of thought to the extreme, we get to this dystopian landscape that you might know. It's a scene from Stalker, from Tarkovsky's film from the 70s, where you have this dystopian landscape of total ruination, when no one or very few people go. It's extremely dangerous. It's a picture of post-apocalyptic destruction, and it kills you unless you have a companion that knows the area, that can guide you towards the very center of this destruction. And what's in the center of this destruction, of this zone, as it's called in the movie? There's supposed to be a room that fulfills every wish you have, or the most important wishes you have. And I think this is the perfect allegory of entrepreneurial object. It's completely destroyed in present. It doesn't have any worth. It's a scene of total desolation and of total destruction. And yet, or maybe precisely because of it, it enables anything to come true potentially in the future. And I would argue that this fascination with decay, when it connects to the potential of a building, something that doesn't exist but might, which is something that Goethe was one of the first to try to describe in his scene of destruction in Frankfurt, is something that makes these scenes of Detroit, decaying Detroit, post-industrial ruins, old factories, so appealing to us, perhaps. And I think that this appeal needs to be criticized, because in a part it's a bit nihilistic. It's talking only about potential. We forget that these buildings exist in the present, and perhaps not the most optimistic way of looking at these buildings is through an entrepreneurial way, how to develop their potential. And these scenes of destruction and of decay surrounds us everywhere today, I would say. It's not only post-industrial ruins. The ruin, while always being a politically charged object, has become especially so in the last 20 years, after the so-called end of history. And it seems almost that the futuristic buildings, and here's one of such buildings from Bulgaria, Budluja Monument, the futuristic buildings cannot be thought of in any other way as catastrophes. As if we all know the 50s, 60s, 70s modernist obsession with futurism in architecture, and this futurism is still here with us today, only it's usually covered in rubble. We know that in the places of former Yugoslavia particularly well, For instance, the national liberation monuments that are spread throughout the country, the former country, or through the already mentioned project of the Home of the Revolution. And you know this scene from Belgrade. It's almost as if this fascination with decay has been transformed into some kind of a new canon of places one must visit, a little bit similar to the grand tour of the 18th century. You know, in the 18th century, rich aristocrats from England would go to Rome, and on their way would sketch the ancient ruins, and there would be a particular canon of places you need to see in order to be a member of the educated public. And today, something similar happens with post-industrial or ruins of the end of the history, where people have 20, 30 places all over the world that they go and photograph and make internet galleries out of it. And I would say that this is not only like some kind of visual stimulation or artistic projects. This fascination with decay has crept into the architecture profession actively. And one of the interesting places where I would say that this shows well in many different ways is in Zurich. At least I would interpret it like that. Perhaps in the later discussion we could discuss it if someone has objections to my understanding of this. But I would say that the Escher-Wyss area in Zurich, which is a former industrial area, like area that any European city has, where industry moved out, and the empty buildings were reconverted to cultural uses, which I don't have a problem with, but I have a problem of how perhaps this was done in this particular area. And I would just briefly go through 3 cases, and each of them, I think, shows this architecture utilization of fascination with decay in a different way. And one of these is a Schiffbau building, which has been converted to a theater. And of course, it's like industrial volume with huge spans can be really well used for contemporary theater infrastructure. But I was more interested in why did the people that converted the interior of this Schiffbau building into extremely high-tech, well-functioning theater painstakingly preserved the broken glass in the windows or layers of decay on the outer layer. I mean, the thing was converted to a very modern, contemporary use, and yet the outer layer was extremely painstakingly preserved as a kind of decaying building. It's as if, you know, the building wasn't revitalized. It's as if it was meant to be squatted, as if to keep the building dead while living in it, in a way. So to preserve the feel of decay while actually utilizing it. Or at least that would be my interpretation. Very near is the Puls 5 building, which is a conversion as well, though you might not think that from this picture. But when you come nearer, you see that behind these curtain walls, there are old industrial walls. And when you go through the double curtain of these walls, you end up in this rather fantastic industrial hall. And the cranes are still hanging from the ceiling, as if they're just waiting for the push of the button to start to move, so that the industrial processes could carry on. And yet, the architecture conversion of this building did something that maybe was opposite to the one that we just saw. It enveloped the whole thing. It didn't squat it. It enveloped the whole thing and left the most impressive hall completely empty. Not touching it, almost preserving a kind of religious feel of the industrial processes leaving the Western world. It's as if you would enter into a post-industrial cathedral, almost sanctifying this emptiness. And every program that has been developed here recently has been really careful to observe this distance from this sanctified emptiness in the middle. As if this emptiness would give some additional meaning, some additional potential to the commercial premises all around. Maybe the most interesting one is the nearby Freitagturm, which is one of the, I mean, it's maybe the most well-known buildings of these three. And also it's a derivative of used to be so popular usages of containers. But when I was walking around, I found particularly interesting to observe other containers in this part of Zurich. Because you see, this part of Zurich is under constant development. So you have a lot of construction sites. And each of the construction sites has a fence and has a few of containers for the construction workers, for the architects, and so forth. And every single container there is like immaculately clean. It's new, or it's extremely well kept. It's preserved. It looks like it just came from the factory. And then you see a finished building out of containers, which goes again to great stress to keep or even recreate the layers of decay on it. So one could almost see that when the building was constructed, then specialists came and applied this additional layer of decay on the structure in order to make it more appealing than a new container would. I find that interesting. So, I mean, these are the three examples of how this fascination with decay maybe is used by the architects without trying to establish a critical distance to why this fascination occurs at all. But there's also, I think, opportunity in ruins, so to speak. Or if I would be a little bit skeptical of my own title of the lecture, that there is actually a potential in the ruins. And I always referred here to this still, to me, extremely interesting project of Le Coton and Vasal, which I think touched on some nerves in architecture profession. And it's and you might know it very well, so I'm sorry if I'm again describing a thing that you might very well know. But it's a small square in Bordeaux. It's a Place Léon au Coq, and Le Coton and Vasal were commissioned to convert it into something new in 1996 by the Bordeaux mayor. Of course, whenever the architects are commissioned by a project, they go and see what could be done better, because something can always be done better, or at least this is how we usually think. You can always make things more interesting, they can always function better, and so forth. But after a prolonged experience of how this square functioned throughout the year, this was put under the question mark by the architects. I mean, the place truly isn't anything special, but it still functioned pretty well with people inhabiting the outskirts of the square. Children were playing here, people were sitting on the benches, and the more they questioned what to do, the less there were any reasons to do it. And in the end, the whole project, as you may know, consisted only of instructions how to keep the square exactly as it is, or how to just change just to keep up the paving and the benches. Every now and then you need to apply some paint to the benches to protect them, and that's it. And I think that this was some kind of a radical break when compared to the usual way the architects think about spaces. And I'm sure that it was subversive in a way towards the people who commissioned the project, because the mayor of Bordeaux, this was one of his inaugural statements, wanted to make a few projects all around the city to put his mark in the city, to make things different, to make them better, and so forth. But I think that maybe even more than that, it was an act that was violent to the architecture profession itself. And if I refer here to the potential I've been talking at the start, I think that out of numerous potentials, if you would say that Goethe could say here, this place is nothing special right now, but it could become 1,000 of different instances in the future. And this speculative element could be strengthened by a good architect. He could build new pavements, fountains. He could embellish this place with lots of different things and different uses. But what actually happened was that the potential was eliminated. Architects here haven't taken the role of the amplifiers of any potential, or people who develop this potential or show that it's possible. They, in a way, eliminated the potential of this square, eliminating any kind of potential future of this area, and in that way, extremely strengthened the now in this space. So, while this is not a typical ruin, of course, but it certainly was a space that didn't have any kind of now, didn't have any kind of the present. No one saw it as a place of any kind of present worth. And with this radical act of saying it's just fine as it is by the people who are supposed to say we'll make it better, the potential, the entrepreneurial futures were cut off, and the present of the place was strengthened extremely. And I think that this role of the architect as the eliminator of the potential is extremely interesting. It's also rather hard to codify, because if you start doing that and just walking around and say it's just fine as it is, you end up in a cul-de-sac. You formalize the act, and you're back where you started from. So I don't think that the solution to the architecture problem of being just a help to entrepreneurs is saying everything is just fine as it is. But I think that it shows a kind of a small hole in the wall that the architecture practice could perhaps try to squeeze through. And another project of Le Coton et Vasal tries to maybe, at least in my eyes, do that precisely, which is even more famous conversion of the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, where an extremely expensive redevelopment of the Art Deco Palace was stopped because of the lack of funds, and Le Coton et Vasal made a successful attempt to try to reconvert the building with a fraction of the original cost. I think it was 3 million euros for the whole project. And here, I think this differs fundamentally from the Zurich examples I've been showing, because it doesn't try to preserve any kind of distance, aura, one might say, if one would use Benjamin, on the building. It doesn't try to distance the viewer from the layer of decay. It just tries to create a kind of productive conflict in between the old building and the new uses. And I think that productive conflict is the interesting way to look at it, because the old building was used for was built for a specific purpose. It was designed by the architects for a specific purpose, and in curating this conflict in between the building that had this specific purpose but lost it, was empty, and was then inserted a new program that differs fundamentally from the first. You get this. You get the element, this reuse element, that utilizes the true fascination of a ruin, a true appeal of the ruin, which is when you walk into a ruin, its primary fascination is that you can go where you couldn't go according to the architect who designed it originally. So if an architect built a structure that has doors and windows and has, in a way, a strong program that's applied to it, that, of course, you can use it in other ways, but it implies a certain way of functioning. It implies a certain program, it implies a certain movement through the building. And when a building is decaying, when it's empty, it suddenly some other possibilities open up. You know, the walls crumble. There's a hole in the wall that you can go through that you could never go according to the original plans. You can suddenly use the hall that was used as cinema for, I don't know, you can build a wall through it and make it an extremely unusual place. You get all sorts of opportunities that could perhaps by definition never be designed, because architects usually tend to design according to a specific program. And that means that everything is bounded in advance with the program that has been pre-designed. And the opportunity of the ruin here is precisely in not designing the program beforehand. It's as if you would have two autonomous subjects, a building and user, and you would interpolate them and see what happens. And I think that my thesis here would be that this productive conflict, as I try to describe it, emancipates architecture as well as the user. In a way, they become free of, or at least partially free, from the conventional expectancies of a building expects you to behave in a certain way, usually, and the user expects to use a building in a certain way. And when reusing an old building, or decaying building, or a ruin, this dynamics breaks off a little bit. And I think that's the true, or maybe the only potential of a ruin that could be productively applied in the future. This is the true potential, I would argue. We could speculate that this points somewhere above the Taylorism of architecture. Taylorism is as in architects tailoring the building according to specific needs, but also Taylorism as a word that defines this kind of industrial way of designing. So Taylor used to have this kind of photography to look into the workers' movements, to see what is the excessive amount of work still present in the worker. So if he uses his hammer with a bit more force that he would need to, and how could we economize this still further? So it was in a way a total usage of a human being or of a worker to eliminate any kind of excessive energy. And I think that in post-industrial era, it would be interesting to go to attack this notion, or to try to articulate in an architectural way how not to utilize everything according to no excess, but how to use this excess and create this kind of a conflict in between the user and the architecture. Because the ruin in the end is pure excess, right? It's defined by it's not being used. It's basically waste in architecture. Ruin is a waste, a trash bin of architecture. And while this makes sense in a market economy, I think that with consistent with consistent use of this reuse approach, we could perhaps arrive to some point in the future where the ruin reused would eliminate the concept of waste itself. I mean, if you don't allow for the waste to happen, if you inhabit it, then perhaps the notion of waste itself would become wasteful. Because people inhabit waste, right? It happens in favelas, it happens in all the horrible places that we don't want to either hear about it or are extremely patronizing when talking about it in architecture. And I think that more interesting than how to put people out of this waste is how to put the whole society and the architecture into waste, if you know how metaphorically I mean that. With that, eliminating the notion of waste itself. And I think that this is the opportunity of reusism at its extreme, in order to fill in the objects of architecture with new uses, and an architect being this new curator of the productive conflict in between the user and the object, perhaps means that we have an opportunity to eliminate waste, to eliminate the notion of the ruin itself. Thank you for your attention.